Hello. So, in today's lesson, we want to look at what English opposition did Elizabeth face to her religious settlement. If you remember from last lesson, that's Elizabeth's aim, that's Elizabeth's plan to make religious groups in England agree on a compromise, agree on what the religion for the country should be. So, our lesson objectives for this lesson, we're going to try to understand how and why different groups in England responded to Elizabeth's religious settlements. And we're going to try to understand how and why Elizabeth responded as she did to the challenges to her settlement from different groups. So, this work is due in Sunday the 24th of May at 5 p.m. Any questions that you might have, you can either email your history teacher or you can email me as well. You should have this worksheet from Google Classrooms open to fill in when prompted. Okay, so Elizabeth, we saw last lesson, had tried to create a religious system that would please most people in England. Now, like I said, this lesson will look at the reaction of England to the settlement and see how successful it was. So, let's start off by looking at the priests first of all. How did the priests take to this religious settlement? Well, all of the members of the church, and we call those the clergy, they had to take the oath of supremacy. If you remember, this was them saying that they would obey Elizabeth and do as she wanted, and she was governor of the church. Now, on record, roughly about 8,000 priests did that. They took the oath and they swore loyalty to Elizabeth. Now, there was about 10,000 churches at the time in England, so that's roughly an 80% success rate. However, the more higher up clergy, the bishops, well, they were all Catholic. And they had no intention really of swearing loyalty to Elizabeth. And so all but one of them stepped down. They said, no, the Pope is my leader, not you, Elizabeth. And they refused to swear the oath of supremacy. Now, luckily, Elizabeth had just about enough high-ranking clergymen to not be affected by this. You've got to be careful who you make a bishop in England. It's a position of status and power. You can't just pick any old person off the street and make them a bishop. But she had just about enough Protestants and Puritans, we'll come on to those in a minute, that she could have them replaced. Now, the Puritans, if you remember, were extreme Protestants. And they thought if they took positions of being a bishop, that maybe they could bring some more Puritan ideas. Maybe they could influence Elizabeth to keep changing religion. What about the people of England? Well, the majority of people in England accepted the settlement. Even if they were Catholic, they accepted these changes that Elizabeth had brought in for the time being. And I suspect that when they saw a Protestant was in charge, they had probably feared far worse. If you remember, Mary, when she had taken the throne before and she was a Catholic, she had burnt over 300 Protestants. And I suspect some of the Catholics had feared a bit of revenge here, a bit of retribution. Now, we looked at religious settlement last lesson, and actually the Catholics could interpret the prayer book in their own way so it made sense to their own beliefs. It didn't feel like a Protestant book being forced on them. They could still use it in their own Catholic way. And also, the Catholics could worship privately at home. And Elizabeth was aware of this, but she was turning a bit of a blind eye. She wasn't checking up on this too much. She knew that the Catholics would do this. She knew that the Catholics wouldn't just change their religion to being a Protestant. Religion is too much to these people. Religion is everything. But she didn't really care what the Catholics got up to, as long as publicly they went to church and they obeyed. Now, some Catholics avoided going to the church services, despite the fact they were meant to go at least once a week. They were meant to be fined, if you remember, about a week's wages, about £1, if they didn't go to church. But Elizabeth didn't chase up this into too much detail. She didn't keep too close an eye on the Catholics. She didn't have this rule enforced too harshly. So there were some Catholics who didn't go to church and they got away with it. Now, these Catholics are what we call at the Bottinet recusants. That's Catholics unwilling to attend the church services of the religious settlements. Now, why was this the case? Why did Elizabeth not enforce and make sure every Catholic went? Well, Elizabeth didn't want to create what we'd call a martyr, someone who was killed for their religious beliefs. Elizabeth was worried that if she started to target the Catholics, then actually they might unite against her. There were still a lot of Catholics in England. She was trying to please them. And so, up to 1569, it seems like the Catholics in England had accepted Elizabeth and her settlement. For that first decade, there was some form of peace there. It certainly wasn't as bad as it could have been. Now that will change. We'll look at that in a few lessons' time, when actually the Catholics start to rebel and cause more problems to Elizabeth. But up to 1569, there was no significant damage to the settlements. Catholics did worship at home in the Catholic way still. Some Catholics were recusants and refused to go, but in general, there was no major disturbance to the religious settlements there. Okay, so task 1, if you have a look at this worksheet then, we've got those groups that we've just looked at. Those slides on the purple background should help with this if you need to go back. And I've just put there in this table clergy, bishops and ordinary people. All I'd like you to do is first of all explain how they reacted to the religious settlement. Try to bring this into your own words. If you can, don't just tell me how they reacted, but why they reacted this way. And then the next column we can see I'd like you to grade them. How successful was Elizabeth in getting this group to accept the settlement? You're going to give it a score out of 10. 0 is very low. It was a complete failure. 10 is it was very high. It was a success. So you can see I've marked those boxes there where you just give a number rating. Pause the video here to complete that task and then press play to continue. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about another religious group then, the Puritans. Now, if you remember, these are extreme Protestants. These are people who feel that the Catholic faith is the wrong way to worship and that people need to worship in their way, a more simple way, a more pure way, that name Puritans there, in order to be closer to God. Now, when Elizabeth took the throne, the Puritans thought these changes Elizabeth made to religion would be just a start, and that Elizabeth would get rid of all elements of the Catholic religion or Catholicism completely. And actually, they were disappointed when Elizabeth said, well, no, that's my religious sentiment is that. We're not going to any other changes. This is it now. Elizabeth said the problem of religion had been dealt with completely. She was trying to unite England. Now, the Puritans were only a small group in England, but they did give Elizabeth some issues there. Let's try and understand 2 of them. So the first one is the use of the crucifix. Now, Elizabeth, if you remember, wanted churches to have a crucifix in. There are 2 reasons for this. First of all, because she wanted churches to still appear familiar to the Catholics. You can see there we've got a picture of a crucifix in a Catholic church. She didn't want to change too much for the Catholics. She wanted them to still feel like they could recognise the church. Putting a crucifix there would be one way of achieving that. But also Elizabeth liked some Catholic ideas, and this was one of them, the crucifix. And if we want proof of this, she had one of her own private royal chapel. So there were some parts of the Catholic religion she liked and she wanted to bring into her religious settlements. But let's look at a Puritan church. So we've got that image there of the Catholic Church, but this is what a Puritan church looks like. And if we go back, you can see there is a huge difference there. Puritans don't want any what we call idols. And that means objects that people worship, that people might pray in front of, just like a crucifix. They want their churches, as you can see, to be clear. They want to be empty. We've got these whitewashed walls. They want to be able to focus on worshipping God, and they don't want any distractions. They believe that the Catholic Church is too colourful, and so doesn't allow them to worship God in the correct way. There's too many distractions there. So what happens? Well, the Puritan bishops, if you remember, who had accepted these positions that Elizabeth gave, they threatened to resign over being forced to have a crucifix in their church. They said, we don't believe we should have idols. We will all step down. Now, Elizabeth was sort of blackmailed at this point. She backed down over this. Elizabeth knew she needed the bishops to help her run the churches, and she didn't have suitable replacements if these Puritan bishops stepped down. Again, it's not like you can just bring people in off the street and make them a bishop. And so Elizabeth said the crucifixes were not necessary, but she would still keep one in her royal chapel, probably as a symbol of how much she believed in her own religious settlements. So what's the result here? This is a Puritan victory. They were able to remove the crucifixes from the church. They were essentially able to tell the Queen what to do. Let's look at the second issue, the vestments. When we say vestments, we basically mean clergy robes. Now, another issue was what the priests wore. Now, Elizabeth said she wanted the clergy to wear special vestments to make them stand out so you knew who the priest was in the church. Now, again, this would help the Catholics. The Catholics believed that priests were special. For example, that they could forgive sins. And so the priests would wear these robes so they stood out in the church. However, the Puritans did not want this. The Puritans did not think that the priests had special powers or could forgive sins. That was only God can do that, not priests. And that the priest shouldn't stand out in the church. The priest should wear what all the other Puritans wore, which is what you can see in that picture. Those black robes, plain, simple black robes. They didn't want priests to stand out. And they were becoming more and more angry that Elizabeth was telling them they had to put these vestments on when they conducted church services. And more of them started to ignore this. And Elizabeth became aware of the fact that there were lots of people in England starting to ignore little bits like this in a church service, starting to ignore wearing the vestments. And by 1565, that should say, it was clear that some of the clergy were not wearing what the Queen had commanded. They were also not following services as she had requested. And so Elizabeth needed to take action here. Again, 1565, ignore that PowerPoint. So what did Elizabeth do? In 1566, the Archbishop, that's an incredibly important position of power in England, very important bishop, of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, he worked with Elizabeth. He agreed with Elizabeth this was a problem and they needed to find a solution. So Matthew Parker told priests what to do and what to say in his Book of Advertisements. He made it very clear. He showed pictures, he showed diagrams, there were written explanations, and this followed Elizabeth's commands. So he made sure that everyone had a copy of this book which said exactly what to do and reinforced the message from Elizabeth. He invited priests to a special London exhibition so he could show these priests exactly what to wear and when they should wear them. Sort of like a fashion show, a Tudor fashion show, if you like. Now, this really upset some members of the clergy, and the 110 clergy members, including bishops, refused to attend. They said, we're not going to this, we're not being told what to wear. These people were standing their ground. We've again got members of the clergy standing their ground, just like the bishops had done with the crucifix. So what happened this time? The difference is Elizabeth didn't give in this time to the Puritans. She insisted, and if those who refused to wear the vestments lost their jobs, some were arrested. And here we've got the difference now. There's a bit more time has gone by. Elizabeth has developed a bit more power over her religious settlements, and now she's showing her authority. The majority of the priests now wore the vestments, whether they liked it or not. Elizabeth had shown control over the church. She had got rid of the second Puritan challenge. The result, a clear victory here for Elizabeth. So, here's a question. Why did Elizabeth not try to please the Puritans? They were a form of Protestants, just like she was. But we must remember the following. First of all, they were only a small group in England. They were mostly based in southeast London. They did not make up the majority of London, just like Catholics were a much larger group that she had to please. The Puritans are a much smaller group. They wanted too much change. This would have upset the Catholics, a much larger group. Basically, the Puritans were an extreme group who wanted English religion to be completely changed. The Catholics would never have got on board with that. So who do you try to please? The small Puritan group or the much larger Catholic group? The choice was fairly obvious for Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth liked some Catholic ideas like the crucifixes that we've seen here. The Puritans also, if you remember before, they didn't want anybody in charge of the church. Now, this was a challenge to Elizabeth's power and authority. She believed she'd been chosen by God to rule, and that actually the church was under her commands. She wasn't going to listen to the Puritans who said that the monarch had no right to control the church. And actually, Elizabeth knew that the Puritans were never really going to remove her from power, that Elizabeth was the best option the Puritans had. The heir to the throne, if Elizabeth died, would be Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a Catholic. So the Puritans might not have liked Elizabeth, but they knew that they had to stick with her. Now, your next task. On the yellow slides, I would like 2 reasons why the Puritans challenged the religious settlement. Please can you explain them in full? Tell me about the crucifixes. Tell me about the vestments. Why did this upset the Puritans? Pause it here to complete that task, and then press play to continue. And your final task for today. Elizabeth's religious settlement was mostly accepted by England from 1559 to 1569. That's the dates that we've been looking at in today's lesson. All I'd like you to do, please, is write me a paragraph, not 2 or 3 lines, but a paragraph telling me if you agree or disagree with this statement. And I want evidence to back this up. I want to know names of groups and what they did, which has made you have that viewpoint. And I would like, please, if you can, bring those specific terminology that we've looked at in today's lesson to make your work really stand out. Things like martyr, recusants, and so on. Pause the video here to complete this final task, and then press play to end this lesson. And that's it, guys. Thank you very much, as always. So, this worksheet is due in Sunday the 24th of May at 5 p.m. Please make sure you submit your work. Please make sure that it's there for us to check. As always, any questions or feedback, email me, gbrown@stopseyhighschool.co.uk. Thank you for your hard work this week. We will look next week at challenges Elizabeth faced abroad to the religious settlements. Places like Catholic Spain, Catholic France. How did they react to Elizabeth taking the throne? Until then, please look after yourselves. Please make sure you're getting some fresh air, exercise as always. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.